Hello, I'm Greg Lowen, and I'm going to read to you the first chapter and the prologue of Raven Today, which is an arc of folktales I wrote after the spirit of the Pacific Northwest coastal indigenous peoples, which is the region where I was born and raised. The book is called Raven Today, and this is a brief synopsis. The great coastal spirit, Raven, as well as his friends, famous for their transformational powers, have realized that the world itself has now been transformed from the outside in. Raven finds himself confronting the greatest mystery of all. Why do the newcomers appear, and what do they want? Through a series of novel encounters and adventures, Raven needs to use all of his legendary acumen, cleverness, and insight to solve the challenges set before him and his friends and allies. These include the dark mystery of a leper colony, the dangerous shadow of the abandoned village site, the desperation of his children lost in the cityscape, and the puzzle of the houses of artifacts. With great imagination, compassion, and a poignant sense of recent history, Raven pushes through from the far end of what was the past to a place where the future of his people can begin anew. Thank you for listening. This is the prologue. How the daughter of Kayumin became human. Kayumin the guardian lived deep in the shadowy forest between the world of spirits and the world of people. She was fierce yet compassionate. Her sharp fangs and claws told people to stay away while they were alive, but when they came to the time they needed to pass through the forest, she would be there to guide them, even letting them rest for a time against her soft, warm, velvety fur coat. She would then point them in the direction of the world of spirits, keeping them safe until they passed over. One day, one of Kayumin's children wandered off. The little one had passed over into the world of people, where her mother could not follow. When she discovered her loss, the guardian became distraught, alternating between great sorrow and great anger. She cried out for her cub, hoping her daughter would run back, but as time passed, Kayumin suspected that her little one had passed back over and could not yet return. She gave in to her anger and snarled her raspy roar. Her snarls became so loud that they shook the ancient trees of the deep forest. Halfway up one of the giant hemlocks, Raven was slumbering. But suddenly the tree and earth shook and awakened him. "Good grief!" he exclaimed, groggy in the gentle fog. Now that he was half awake, he heard a roar from below. A great snarl filled the forest, and Raven, now fully awake, knew then it was the guardian. What could have made her so angry? He floated gently downwards, not wanting to startle the great beast below and make her even more fierce. He settled down close by and spoke to her. "Kayumin, what has happened?" The guardian glanced up quickly and exclaimed, "I am so glad to see you, Raven, for my daughter has wandered, and I fear she has crossed back into the world of people. I cannot follow her there, and she will be lost." The anguish in the guardian's throat moved Raven to thought. He would have to go search for her cub. He told Kayumin to wait patiently for news, and that he would himself look for her child. But he already knew that he would not be able to accomplish such a search successfully by himself. As he flew off in the direction of the land of the people, he realized he needed both a better pair of wings and a better pair of eyes. The only one who had both was his friend Eagle. He would have to search him out first before they could then find the guardian's daughter. Eagle was never quite so easy to find, though. He hunted far up in the sky, and Raven had to peer into the sun with his beady eyes to make him out. The sun, who once he had swallowed and who had turned him black in return for this outlandish trick, stared brightly and interestedly back at him, but did not interfere with his quest. The glare of the sun was intense, however. Not only this, but Raven could not fly as high as Eagle, so he would have to do something to attract his attention so that Eagle would come down to him. The only thing to do, he thought cleverly, would be to place himself between Eagle and his prey. This he then contrived to do. No sooner had he done so, spotting a large salmon in a river below him, he heard an angry cry from above. But the Eagle's outburst suddenly assumed a different tone when he noticed it was his old friend Raven in his way. "Hey there," Eagle cried out. "What are you doing?" "You know I would share with you if you asked," said Raven's friend, assuming that Raven had gotten the idea into his head to capture the salmon himself, and thus had not in fact noticed Eagle much higher up. Raven explained the situation. Kayumin has lost her daughter, and we need to find her. It is almost certain she is in the land of the people by now, having wandered out from the forest." Eagle replied, "My goodness, this is a bad thing." He wheeled up in the air again. "But I shall find her. Follow me," he directed Raven. But Raven could not follow for long. Eagle set a rapid pace, ascending and ascending until he was almost out of sight. Raven would just have to manage the best he could far below. Instead of even trying to keep Eagle in his sight, he listened for his cries and followed him that way. Finally, after many hours of circling and diving, seeking and surmising, Eagle let Raven know with one triumphant shriek that he had found the cub they had been looking for. She was huddled up a small tree on a branch, shivering and mewing, the very picture of sorrow. By the time Raven caught up with his friend, Eagle had long been perched by the little one, speaking to her gently and telling her that Raven would rectify the situation. But Eagle feared that the tiny one did not understand his language. When Raven arrived, he nestled close to the cub and whispered into her felty ear, "Your mother sent me to find you, and I sent Eagle. Now we have found you, and we will save you." The cublet mewed out, "But why has my mother not come herself? She is the greatest of the hunters." Eagle was about to dispute this claim when Raven motioned him to remain silent. Raven replied, "Your mother cannot wander in the land of the people. This is where you have come, by mistake." Kayumin's daughter looked apprehensive. "Am I to be lost here for good, then?" It was then that Raven knew that it was his time to work. He said a fond farewell to his friend, and immediately Eagle was aloft, sailing away effortlessly on the sea breeze. They would meet again soon, he knew, so the parting was not a sorrowful one. But the real work of the clever trickster now had to commence. Raven skillfully lifted up the little one by her furry scruff and began to carry her into the air. The cub was astonished and nervous at the same time. "Where are we going?" she cried out. "I will take you to your mother myself," said Raven proudly. This reassured the daughter of the guardian immensely, and she found that she began to fall asleep in the evening air, so tired was she after such a long walk out of the forest. This was what Raven had hoped would occur. Raven flew and flew, but he was not heading back to the land of the guardian. He headed directly for the villages of the people. In the meanwhile, Raven thought the daughter of Kayumin transformed there in his grip. He finally alighted just out of sight of the village. With a little bump they landed, and the daughter of the guardian suddenly awoke, quite refreshed. Raven let her down by her feet, and she stepped away from the great black bird, once again astonished. "Raven!" exclaimed she, "what on earth are you doing here so close to the village?" "I was taking you back to your mother," Raven replied simply, saying nothing more. "How silly," said the little girl, "for here is my mother right now, coming for me, and my father as well." With a grin at Raven, she ran off in the direction of the two people walking quickly toward her. But as Raven began his long flight back to the forest, it was he who was chuckling in his croaky way, long after the transformed daughter of Kayumin was fast asleep in her new home. She would not recall whom she actually was until it was time to return to the deep forest and pass over to the world of spirits. Then, along the way, she would meet her mother again and know the truth of things. But this was a very long time away, Raven knew. It only remained for Raven to explain the situation to Kayumin herself. It was many hours before the lumbering arc of Raven's wings took him to the right place. When he reappeared in front of the guardian, she looked at him as one worn out, but still with expectancy. She quickly saw that her daughter had not accompanied the clever one back to her home. Her velvety ears started to turn back, and a snarl appeared on her lips. But Raven motioned her to be silent for a moment while he told her of what had occurred. "I knew right away that your daughter would have to wait to meet you again," he explained. "So I had to find for her a new mother and father to look after her in the meanwhile. She also had to become a child of the people, even though in her spirit she remains your child. Her new parents had to somehow be expecting her to return to the land of the people and its villages without understanding what had really happened. I carried her to two persons that made sense. The father is the son of Eagle, the free spirit and visionary. He also has a human name that is related to your own. The mother is a direct cousin of yours. I knew that it would be best for her, and when I dropped down near their village, they had already seen the little girl who they think of as their own daughter, and she, in her way, knew them for her parents without suspecting the trick." Kayumin began to cry, but Raven waited until she had spent her sorrow. "I know this is for the best," she softly snarled. "My daughter could not come back to me without herself dying. It is better that she lives a long life amongst the people before returning. Thank you, Raven, for your wisdom." Raven said farewell to the guardian and flew back up to his perch in the ancient hemlock. It had been a long day's journey for him as well, and he promptly returned to his slumbers. But the world of people and the world of spirits are never themselves asleep. And we, the people, know Raven's presence by his work in both, even if we cannot understand everything about it. We too will meet the guardian, and our work is to do so only at the right time, and not, therefore, to sleep through the world of life. That was the prologue to Raven Today. Chapter 1, Raven and the Leper Colony. That was how it was before. Before, all things seemed possible. A lost child would be found, a dead one returned to life, animals and humans would know one another once again, the poles spoke to their makers, and so on, back and forth. Now Raven found himself cocking his head to one side, peering with his beady eyes at the now, at what was now, and what was now. A long, thin, rocky beach, an island in shadow. At the same time, it was a bright and sunny day. How strange, thought Raven, as he hopped along the cobbles, looking now for this and now that, for the odd bit of food. His attention was ever distracted, however, by the contrast between the other islands he could see and the one that seemed to be enshrouded. Again he cocked his head in the manner he had always affected. The stretch of water between the beach and the island in question wasn't overlong. Generally, Raven did not like to fly over too much water, and never did he go offshore. Even his friend Eagle tended to stick within sight of land, but this journey appeared slight enough. He lifted off, and it was a matter of the lifetime of the smallest thing he had found on the beach to eat to attain the place that had intrigued him. It was covered to the water's edge in trees, many of them from the time of his children. This too was strange, an island out of time, thought Raven. But as he had approached, he had felt a sense of dread, not as intense as when his children had been cut down in vast numbers by an unknown force, something that had made them sick unto death, but similar to that. Raven had not felt that feeling in a very long time, he knew. Touching down on a sandy beach, he immediately noted that there were none of the usual signs that humans, or indeed other animals, had been present there. No marks in the sand, no trash, no brightly colored pieces of a material strange to him, but one that he and his friends had gotten quite used to seeing on beaches. Raven smirked to himself a little then, as he recalled Thunderbird telling him that Sisutel had tried to use a net to capture him and drag him into the ocean, wetting his enormous feathers, and thereby stopping him from flying and bringing the winds that whipped the ocean into a frenzy, making it difficult for Sisutel to remain in the deep water. This had failed, of course, but the idea of it had only become possible with the appearance of nets much larger than any of them had ever been seen before, and made of that same hard, brittle, yet very colorful material. And though Raven peered round intently, as was his way with all things, none of even this oft-ubiquitous stuff presented itself. Instead, a gentle, almost silent wash of a slackening tide revealed some bits of old iron and the stumps of rotted pilings. There had been something here, but what? Raven alit once again and circumnavigated the island. Nothing but dark trees and a brooding coastline. No, this wasn't right at all. The islands between the big island and the mainland were always beautiful, relaxed, and sunny. Yes, fog in the winter, thanks to Thunderbird, but nothing serious. Not like the west coast of the big island, where Sisutel and Thunderbird fought regular pitched battles, and the wind and waves attained enormous proportions. So what was amiss here, then? Raven found it easy to land on the tops of the tall trees here and there, but it was much more difficult to get down into the bulk of the forest to see the rest of the island's interior. He flew round and round for a time, trying this beach and now that, and eventually he came across some crumbling ruins. People had lived here at one time, not for many years, clearly. There was an overwhelming melancholy about the place, so much so that Raven could feel it physically, a strange pressure on him, coming from a deep place. But Raven was himself deep. He had not lost any of his spiritual acumen in the intervening years, between his children being discovered by the new people and today. There had been sparse chance to exert it, of course, and this had all at first dismayed him. He had watched with great concern and compassion the doings of the newcomers, yet he remained, and after a fashion so did his original children. Raven sat on a disused beach by the small clump of ruins and knew then that those who had been born on the coastline were also his children, though they didn't know it yet. Then, in insight, there are also those who are not from this place, not my children, in either the sense of having descended from the first men and women discovered by me, or in the later sense of having been born and raised on the coast. He thought to himself, and in that moment he beheld a spectral vision. There was a shadowy figure in the forest, just there, off to his left. He darted back into what the sun there was, near the water's edge, and set himself. Take flight or plunge into the shadows. But he didn't need decision, as the shape was approaching him. And right then it had become human in form, though it was no longer human. A transformer being, then? Raven, himself a transformer, of course would likely know, or at least have heard of this one then. But it was not so after all, for as it approached, a sound came from the general vicinity of its mouth. Raven was quite taken aback by what he heard. It reminded him of the experience he had had when the newcomers first landed. Raven strained to understand. He could hear, but not listen. The figure spoke in a tongue strange to him, though he had heard snippets thereof from time to time in the great city at the south end of the big island, a place that he did not frequent, as there were few trees to rest in, and too many of his cousin, Crow, who had made himself a million guises, confusing Raven and, more importantly, eating everything in sight. But now Raven had to concentrate, and as he did so, the sounds became words. It was a human tongue, of that there could be no doubt. The transformer beings did not speak like this, and indeed seldom had need to speak at all. Raven could hear their very thoughts and could think to them in return, but with his children, with some exceptions like the shaman, he had to speak aloud. Still, they had almost always understood him. And this, too, wasn't working here. Raven had finally recovered from being startled by the appearance of the thing and croaked out his usual greetings. The figure stopped its own diatribe and then resumed. The words were becoming more clear. Now Raven began to catch some of their meaning. It was a tongue that was still in use, but a version of which that hadn't been spoken in many years. Now Raven knew why he couldn't understand this being. It was speaking to him from beyond the grave. A slight chill passed over him. Would he himself have to pass through the dark tunnel and hop out the other side just to see who this being was and what it wanted? Or had he already done so by coming to this small island of shadow? None of the usual signs were present, though. One could not fly through the narrow passage to the other world. One had to hop or crawl, as the case might be. And nowhere had he encountered the guardian, heard her friendly chuff, and been lulled to sleep by her purring. Not that Raven needed her to guide him there and back, but she had always shown up, since it was both her duty and her nature to do so. Not so here. Raven was gradually accumulating in his shrewd mind a set of facts that spoke against the usual meaning of both life and death. They had, in fact, both been altered by what had transpired in this solemn place. In the space of these musings, the figure's voice had begun to become understandable. Raven cocked his head and leaned forward, so that the tip of his long beak was within a few feet of the spectre. A chill breeze had sprung up, and it ruffled his oily feathers. He squinted into the shadow and asked outright, "Who are you, spirit? What are you doing here? Why do you approach me, the spirit of the coast? And what is this strange place, the one island in the gulf that has no light, when I myself stole the sun and brought it to all the islands?" A wave-like sound washed over him. Then, and after it had subsided, the being's form and voice became as clear as the limpid tidal pools at his feet. "I am Zhang. I was sent here to die, as were the others. A few drowned trying to swim back, and one burned himself to death. Another was taken back by his wife, but they too drowned when their little boat capsized in the waves. 2 were rescued at the very end, but by then the rest of us were already dead." This was shocking, but it actually told Raven little about what had occurred and why, so he pressed on. "Zhang, why were you and these others sent here? And why did 2 survive and the others did not? And most importantly, Spectral One, why are you still here?" This was the one thing that Raven was truly concerned about. He had seen plenty of death and destruction over the years, but in all cases the spirits did not linger, unless something very wrong had happened and they were not able to travel to the other world. This was exceedingly rare, even for the newcomers whose spirits did not seek to return, either immediately, as did those of his original children, or even at all, traveling onward to places that Raven himself had not bothered to visit, as they had entirely severed their connection with the living. "We were diseased, something the white man called leprosy. But it was an excuse. They did not want us living with them. There were 44 of us. The number itself rings of death. And this is the island of death, the one whose sandy beach you now stand upon." At this, Raven instinctively took off and circled the being from a low height. Its tail had begun to give him the shivers, and this too was quite out of character, for after all he was master of both life and death. His children came to know him because he ate from the dead and yet lived on. But this being did not know him, and also did not seem to know that there was a difference between life and death. It was a being who had died and yet had not been able to die, a spirit caught up in the world of the living, and apparently, judging from what it had said thus far, there were others as well who had lost the secret of being. But how was that even possible? Raven mulled it all over from his low arc, but when the spectre beneath him said no more of a space, he once again lit and peered into this shadowy interlocutor. "I have seen much disease and death, much of it happenstance. But you tell me that this illness was used against you. You must be related to my children somehow, for the newcomers did not comfort them, even though they had not tried to sicken them. Even now, after so much time has passed, the spirits of those who died from the newcomers' illnesses are still returning, but not you yourself." I and the others came to this place to gain a life. We were no different from anyone else, but we were not welcome. We could not force a welcome, as did the others, and we did not know in life that those who were already here, and had been here for uncounted years, were our distant cousins. This was our shame, and indeed the start of our downfall. Zhang now had presented himself in almost fully human form. Raven's eyes had slowly adjusted to this liminal scene, something in between the living and the dead. It was not a place Raven traveled to very often, but he had traveled through it on occasion to cajole a wayward spirit back into its living body, one of his children, as was often the case today, but also over the years the spirit of salmon, of wolf, of the great forests, and even the guardian herself he had had to convince to come back, tell them that all was not lost, and that the challenge of the newcomers could be adjusted and ameliorated, if never entirely overcome. I have never met you. For this I apologize. I did not know you and your compatriots were here. Such an island as this is out of time and space. I came here because I could not explain why it appeared the way it does from a distance, dark and gloomy, in the coastal sunshine. It is the gloom of a lingering, the mockery of malingering that makes it so, the sad being replied. Zhang, Raven wondered. The name was not unutterably strange. This transformer being himself had an odd name in some parts. Kanakelak, some of the people called him. Well, then. You said that you are related to my children. How is that so? Ages ago, when the people who were first came from our homeland, but it was so very long ago that everyone forgot, both them and us. This was news. Raven puzzled it out. He did not know that far to the north there was a lengthy archipelago that reached over westward. Eagle had said that he had thought there to be no end of it, and far, far back, when the ice had covered everything and Raven had been forced to rusticate far to the south of his native home, along with all of his friends, and even those who kept their distance from him, like Sisutel, for instance, there might well have been a real bridge. It was after the ice had retreated that Raven had discovered the first men huddled inside a clamshell. They had been washed up on a broad beach and were eternally grateful for his saving them. But indeed, he had saved the people, those who had become his children, precisely because they had already arrived. Here was a great secret, and this odd spectre had helped him figure it out for the first time. I am in your debt, Zhang. I intuit that this is not your place, and that you wish to return to your home. If I can help you, I will do so. At this, the being seemed to gain an almost human form. It nodded, and then from its mouth came an unearthly sound, one that Raven had never heard before. It prickled up his feathers, and once again washed over him like an incoming tide. But after the last vestiges of its sonic transport had faded, Raven beheld that there were now not one spectre standing, swaying slightly before him, but many. 39, he counted quickly. Here we are, great black bird of the day. We await your vehicle. We have longed to return home, since we have been brought here against our will, stranded, marooned, with very little, in the cold and dark and wet, left to die. One of the new spectres now spoke, and now another. Yes, Yupting. We can only rest in peace in our own earth. Far from here, there is no other way for us. A strange land keeps us from finding the spirit world. We are prisoners beyond the grave. In death we suffer the same as we did in life. Raven was astounded once again. He felt a deep compassion for these strange beings. The quest was clear enough. Return them to their home. But where was that? And how to get there? Now he knew why the island seemed to be one great shadow. Almost 40 of these undead spirits populated it. The effect of their presence could be seen at a distance. It blocked the very sun that he had himself stolen to bring light and fire to his children. After rescuing them from the giant clamshell, they must have used to float over to a land newly freed from ice. Well and good. He would have to tell Eagle of his momentous discovery. No one could have known about it, as all of his friends and familiars were already here when his children presented themselves for his rescue. And yet, after an untold age, they themselves have been joined by newcomers, including this group before him. But these beings had the right idea. They wished to return home. Only there could they pass on to the world of spirits. It must be a different version of the one he knows so well. That in itself did not matter in the least, but rather the means for getting them there was now of the utmost. I must fly away for a time and explain the situation to my friend and see if he can help you. But tell me now, how is it that you travel? You must take with you enough of the earth from the little graveyard around the point where the remains of our bones now sit uneasily, back across the great ocean and drop it on a beach there. We can find our own way from that place onward. Oh, this was no small order. Not at all. The ocean that stretched away from the west coast of the big island and the smaller archipelago to its north, where the fiercest of his children lived, was so wide, Raven had never heard anything of its farther side. Indeed, some of his friends claimed that it had no other coast, but clearly, given this request, that was not correct. Fascinating, thought Raven. But the import as well as the gravity of the task that had been presented to him was not to be denied by way of a simple failure of logistics. Raven was the most clever of spirits for a reason, but at first even he was stumped. His friend Eagle would certainly help him, but Raven already knew that even Eagle couldn't make such a flight on his own. It was simply too far. He peered at the now silent but expectant knot of figures before him and then bobbed his head in their direction. "I will help you. I apologize for not knowing you were here and had been here for so long. It is not what my children do." There was a ritual of stranding, but it was for the one who had made him or herself too wild and needed to be taught what true wildness was. So his children marooned a young man or woman on an island to fend for themselves for a season. Inevitably, either wild man or wild woman would appear, thinking that the youth had come to join them and live their life. Ha! Then the youth would understand what it really meant to live apart from community and long to return to the one that they had thought to reject. It always worked, that is, if the youth survived. But the people of this or that village would clandestinely check in on their progeny from time to time, so almost all came back transformed, as it were. Raven thought it clever that his children, who had no real ability to transform themselves in the way the actual transformer beings did, yet still managed to change themselves into something quite different than they had been. That early song that one of the first men had been gifted with after spying trepidatiously in on the cave, where the transformers danced and changed themselves, taught them this art. It had ended with his very own name chanted once, but hardly anyone knew this song anymore. It must be a horrifying thing to be trapped after death, Raven thought, as he flew away from the sorrowful island and back into the bright sunshine of the usual run of things. I must pull out every trick in order to rescue these strange people now, he thought, searching for Eagle. It was a task of a different order than simply prying open a giant clamshell and letting his children loose upon the landscape. This was their home, but these poor beings were so far from their own that Raven wondered how they could ever get back. No doubt the spirits themselves must have tried something over the many years they had been marooned. Indeed, they themselves must have encountered Bukwas or even Sinakwa once in a while, but obviously the wild man and woman would not have thought that these strangers had come to join them. Nor had Raven seen any children that they might have tried to steal away from their community, and though Bukwas was wily and canny, he wasn't the smartest fellow around. There was a reason why he and his sometimes consort lived the way they did. After a while, Raven espied Eagle. As usual, his lofty friend was far aloft in the sky, using the precision of his vision to search for salmon, or even rabbits, far below. The only way to attract his attention from that height was to get between him and his prey. So Raven used that ancient trick and was immediately rewarded with a cry of annoyance and then a friendlier expression of recognition. In the time it took for Raven to catch his breath, there was Eagle hovering beside him. He explained to him the situation, and Eagle whistled aloud. I always wondered why that island looked so dark from above. I used to sometimes fly over it, but the chill wind it emanates pulled me down toward it, so now I tend to go around it. Eagle then confirmed what Raven had already thought. There was no way his friend could fly all the way across the great ocean that seemed unending. They had to come up with a different plan. Thunderbird was the obvious next choice. His wingspan was so huge that he had once attempted to lift a whale right out of the water. This ended in disaster, of course, but nevertheless, even the attempt had come down through the ages in song and dance. Raven smirked to himself, recalling watching the somewhat vain bird pick up whale and then promptly drop it, forming a mountain and shaking the earth. These quakes, as the newcomers called them, had a number of causes, but that had to have been one of them. Eagle was already in search of the great bird, and Raven was left once again to ponder other ideas. Thunderbird, for all his size and vanity, had never been all the way to the other side of the ocean either, and he would tell them that he needed to stay close to home in order that Cecile will not gain an untoward ascendancy. Their battles tired Raven, who had to take refuge in the limbs of a giant hemlock or Sitka spruce and wait out the torrential rains that always came when the spirits of the sky and water fought with each other. But summer was a slack time for that anyway. Perhaps he could be persuaded. In the meanwhile, Raven knew he had been missing something. It was one of those times when you know something but can't quite recall either what it is or how you knew it. Thunderbird had lifted Whale up, carrying her for a short time. Raven himself had been carried inside a whale, traveling far. That was it! But now Eagle had returned with negative news. Oh, Thunderbird flew way up north and would not come back for some months, my friend. Raven, I heard this from the salmon spirit because I had gotten hungry on my long flight to find him. Aha, Raven figured as much, and it was like Salmon to know of these things, since she migrated to great distances. Indeed, Salmon herself might have been able to help them, but she couldn't carry the earth of 39 undead souls in her belly. She was simply too small for the task at hand. No, it had to be either Killer Whale or Whale herself. The first was irascible and might well refuse their request. He was one of the few spirits who would say no to him, Raven knew, and he couldn't blame him, for it was such a long journey no one knew how long it would take. But the real whale, the great she-spirit that fed entire villages for entire seasons, was both big enough and kind enough to perform the duty. Convincing her that it was her duty would be the trick necessary now, but Eagle was still speaking. I once flew so far south, at Kayumin's request, that I encountered a great bird who flew even higher than myself. It called itself Condor, and could fly over the highest of their mountains, far higher than those over there. Eagle flicked a wing at the coast range, looking sharp and jagged in the bright sunlight. Raven was impressed. Why did the guardian ask you to visit such a place? Her beautiful cousin, Jaguar, lives down there, but it is too far to walk. I deliver messages once in a while, but now the great bird I met meets me halfway, which is of great help. Raven took all of this in, then made a suggestion to Eagle. His friend brightened up at it, but then replied, Kayumin's cousin is more mysterious than even she herself. She is not so much a guide as the thing itself. You mean she does not only take the dead to the spirit world, she also kills them first? Eagle nodded. Oh, well, that was a little scary, Raven thought to himself. But immediately he realized that this was the way of being of what was now called nature, but really what was transformational and spiritual. Yet humans had tried to mimic this spirituality by casting ashore those that were to die. Perhaps there was some wisdom in Eagle's tale of his furthest travels to date. The Jaguar was the spiritual version of the death that the newcomers had imposed upon their strange brothers, the ones they now sought to return home. We must see if Whale will take the earth into her belly and transport it across the ocean to these spirits' homeland, Raven stated. Eagle was immediately 50 feet higher than was Raven, and no doubt had already begun to scan the waters for a sign that Whale was present. A water spout in the air would tell of her breath, a giant tail flung high above the water, her more full presence, but neither of these could be seen anywhere close by. The two friends agreed to split up and meet again in 3 days. Raven knew his part in this search would be flimsy, so he concentrated on finding another way to let Whale know they needed her help. What he came up with was convoluted, but it might work. Besides, given what Zhang had told him of the sorrowful history of his comrades, he had another idea. Flying low now, out over the water, deeper and deeper below him, he peered into its liquid medium. He shaped his wings in a certain way so that when seen through the water, his entire figure would look very similar to that of Skate's. Making a disturbance on the ocean soon brought the curious but territorial character up to him, for just below, Skate looked up. Why, Raven, you old rascal, whatever are you doing out here hovering so close to the water? You know Sisudal might seek to play one of his own tricks on you for a change. To this Raven heartily croaked, and then they were both chuckling. Skate was generally benign, but he did have a sting to him. He had, by means of an obvious ruse, flummoxed Thunderbird in a famous stick fight long years ago. The great bird, so given he to grandiose displays, conjured both fog and lightning to stifle Skate's throws in turn, but Skate was judged the more clever, since he simply had turned sideways, and thereby Thunderbird had almost nothing to hit. Now Raven needed him to come up with a similarly simple device by which to attract the attention of the sea monster, with whom few were friends. When Skate heard of what Raven was asking, he flexed his entire shape into a semicircle and shot off into the darkness. Raven glided up a pace, away from the dangers of the water's surface, and circled as lazily as he could. Well, after all of the years of delay, perhaps the spirit's morale would be boosted just by knowing that he and his friends were seeking a solution. By now, the island of shadows was long out of sight, as Raven had flown northward. But the shadow it cast upon Raven's soul had not abated. It was, writ small, of a hue too similar to what he had witnessed occur to his own children to be too lightly dismissed. Raven was aware that he had another half-opened book in his talents, of which the end was murky, but nonetheless, by pressing on, he felt he might well come to another, much larger conclusion given enough time. For what had happened to the sorrowful spirits of Shadow Island was not merely an echo of what had happened to his children, but somehow part of the same event. He began a list of sorts. 1. The undead castaways were related to those he had discovered and set free of the clamshell. They must share a common ancestor, far, far back. Perhaps his friends also shared one with the transformational animal beings of this faraway land. These people had their own name for himself, for example, almost unpronounceable to his ears, but even so. And illness was a common factor. But he knew that what had struck down his children in vast numbers was not the same illness as these people had suffered from. For one, it was not as contagious. No, they had told him that a larger factor was simple bigotry. That, too, was a common factor. That's 4 things right there, Raven mused. And that both his children and these strangers had forgotten they were related to one another, and that had also been part of their shared downfall. Like the youths who for a time forgot their obligation to the community into which they had returned from the spirit world, only to be brought back into their common humanity by the wild ones, the absence of a collective memory that would have linked these two peoples over a vast distance had allowed the newcomers to appear and essentially take over. Once here, however, it had been a different story. These people too forgot where they had come from, and over time those born in the land of Raven became his unwitting children. Still, there was a gap in understanding this. Raven realized just then that he had been presented with a clue to possibly solving this larger mystery. And just then Raven was very glad he had ascended to a decent height above the surface of the inland sea, for now he felt a drench of salt water around him. A waterspout had shot up from the surface and petered out just below him, its spray causing his feathers to droop slightly and allow the drips to roll off. His oily plumage, jet in color and making an entrancing swoosh as he flew low, did not suffer from this small amount of water, but it could have been much worse. And speaking of the stormy horizon of surface tension, present and yet muted, Sissyutl suddenly appeared beneath, leering up. "This better be good, Raven. Everyone knows how clever you are, but we all know that half your smarts consist in convincing others to work for you." That was a little harsh, but the sea monster always erred on the side of hyperbole. "I know you have stolen the spirits of 4 strangers, uncommon commoner, and I want them back. They do not wish to remain here, let alone with you." To this the monster reacted with surprise, but he quickly brought his eldritch features under control and set his face. "What are you offering in return?" Sissyutl knew that there was no use denying something to Raven that Raven already knew, so he immediately struck up bargaining with him. "I will delay Thunderbird's return for 4 months, starting in autumn this year." Oh, this seemed to be a bargain, as it meant that the monster would not be distracted by the perennial battle of sea and sky for a significant amount of time. In the interim, he could eat as much fish as he chose, dive to depths that he seldom had the chance to see, and thus visit with his murky, undinal friends, halibut and grouper, to name 2 of a relatively short list. "Agreed, then. Where do you wish me to deposit them?" Raven beckoned the sea monster to follow him just under the surface, as to not scare any of his people who might be fishing, and headed back south to the island in question. When they had arrived, Eagle was still not yet returned. "I recall this is the place where I found them, more or less," the monster gurgled up at Raven. Then, with an unspeakable sound and a raucous motion, Sissyutl spat out a load of water onto the beach, soaking it from end to end. The sun would dry it out, of course, and then Raven expected to see 4 new figures join the ones whom he had already met. "I am grateful to you, O munificent one." Raven was not quite sarcastic. "Your end of the bargain, or I will overturn every canoer I encounter for a year and consume the spirits of your children who are aboard them," Sissyutl warned. Raven was not all that concerned. It would be an easy thing to ask Thunderbird to simply remain far to the north for a season, because equally, the giant bird had his rounds that he too was distracted from by having to fight with the sea monster. The only issue would be that autumn into winter would be unseasonably warm. It might lend the notion to the people that the entire Earth was changing out of their control, and Raven had noticed that sun had been creeping closer and closer to the Earth. Why, he didn't yet know. But that too was something now in the back of his mind that Raven would have to try to adjust, sooner rather than later. But unlike Sissyutl, Sun was a good-hearted spirit who enjoyed warming the land. Maybe enjoyed it too much, perhaps. Raven knew he couldn't be burned any blacker than he was, so the next time he would encounter Sun, he would merely have to shade his eyes away from the glare. But speaking of which, Sun, from afar, had dissolved Sissyutl's temporary tantrum into the air, and remaining there, out on the beach and gaping, were 4 new spirits, 3 men and a woman this time. She must be the loyal, courageous, and determined mate of one of the men who had sought to rescue him from his forced imprisonment. He spoke to them. "I know of your predicament. I commend thee, O brave woman, for your earlier solution and regret your misfortune after you had been reunited with your mate. But even as I speak to you, my friends are hoping to find a way to return all 43 of you to your homeland, away from this benighted place." Raven realized that it wasn't the place that was so, but that it had become so because of human action. He cocked his head at them, awaiting a reply. "We are grateful from beyond the grave for your efforts," one said. It was obvious who the 2 lovers were now, as they had joined with one another, mingling their ethereal forms. That, at least, was something positive, Raven thought to himself. But there was no point lingering here. Wait. "I set off from the very beach from which you first noted our presence," the woman stated. How could she know of this? Raven was puzzled. Then he sensed it might have been the echo of her brave action that he had in first fact noted. For what intuition had caused him even to look out across the water and see the shrouded island in the first place? How clever. Now seemingly understanding the woman's ellipsis, he bobbed his head at her and gave a cheery croak of acknowledgement. Flying up and off again, he soon saw Eagle in the distance, but it was what was far below him that was actually more interesting and important at the moment. A giant wake, then a splashing tail. It was Whale. She had returned with Eagle. Now Raven wondered if Eagle had a few tricks of his own to have not only found Whale but convinced her return. But all was not quite brilliant. Whale had transported herself as an old woman of the sea, her body covered in spots with giant barnacle clusters. Why was this? Surely they needed a prime young form to make a journey so very long. But Eagle was now upon him, some miles ahead of his watery companion. "Raven, old friend, it is thus, and I am saddened to tell of it." At this Raven peered quizzically at his comrade. "Whale told me that she can do what you have asked, but it will be her final journey." "Goodness, why is this?" "Apparently this is what she does. Have you never wondered why Whale sometimes beaches herself only to die by stranding? I have seen it from high above, and I must admit to hurtling down to eat of her carcass time and again." This was not such a confession, Raven thought, as he had also done so countless times. But Raven had not thought all that much about it, assuming that Whale had simply known that it was her time and that this was her final act of giant generosity, leaving all of her to his children. No part of her worldly being would be wasted. But now it seemed like there was quite a bit more to it. Raven was keenly intrigued, but knew he would have to wait until the creature herself was within range. "I will tell the strange cousins of my children the news," he stated instead, and flew back to the island where they had now congregated on the beach. 42 of them had been prisoners, and one a would-be rescuer. But now, before Whale finally arrived, he had a job that only he could do. Hovering over to the aged and decrepit graveyard, itself fenced in by some slatternly and sloping timbers, he picked through the soil, using his keen sense of the dead to locate every remaining morsel of mortality. There wasn't much, a rueful accounting of another time, wherein such acts as despicable as those that had led to the stranger's collective demise were now shunned. But what were the echoes of these acts that themselves remained in the present, and how to discern them? For they were not the dead, or not yet the dead, and Raven himself would have to find another way to search them out if he wanted to prevent guises of them from recurring. As he pecked and prodded the pile of earth together, the spirits watched him from a slight distance. At each peck of the earth their forms shook slightly. Raven apologized, but they waved it off. Now he could find no more, no matter how deeply he probed. He received confirmation that all of the souls were represented in this pile, with the exception of the 4 who had been lost at sea. But they had already been returned complete with their mortal recoil, recalling that when Sisutol had picked them out of the water, he had stored what was left of their bodies inside him, as well as the spirits. A cry from above no doubt meant that Whale had hove into sight, and Eagle was alerting him. He alit once again and attained Eagle's altitude after a few minutes of hard work. And now he saw her, placid and yet profound, like a force of the very nature to which they all owed their existence. Raven had heard that Whale could communicate over vast distances, far further than anyone else, but her language was a sophisticated sonic tapestry that had forced Raven and the others to transform their hearing in a novel manner. Now he did so again, and the voice of Whale came into his head. "Raven, beloved bird, trickster tried and true, even you did not guess at my final duty," was what she opened with. "Your death was coincidental, then?" Raven tried in return. "Not entirely, no. When I die, it is because I have given my life to others, but you thought it was only those others who live in the world of persons." Aha! Now Raven began to comprehend what the great being was speaking of. "You also give life to those who live in the world of spirits?" Yes, this was it, but how exactly? "Any time one of my kind strands itself, I bring that spirit into me, but in doing so she has delivered the spirits of those who have been lost back to their origins. It is uncommon, but it is still a regular occurrence, as there are always those who become lost in life, and it is these who must come home in death." This was poignant, Raven agreed, and now this one would do the same for these 43 lost souls. "I am ready to receive them now," Whale declared, pushing up above the water and opening her blowhole, expelling a geyser of seawater and salty spray into the air. But she then held it open, and Eagle and Raven both realized that a rapid transport was now called for. Between the two of them, they scooped the relevant earth into their beaks and flew down close over Whale, dropping it into her breathing hole. The breath of what still lived would reanimate the ashes of the grave. After 2 trips each, the work was done, and Raven started a little to see that all of the figures who had waited on the beach for their vessel of sacred return had vanished. "I will return once again anew," Whale reassured the 2 friends circling above her. It was still a bittersweet farewell. Whale had once again decided to sacrifice herself in order that others be able to move on. Yet the distance in this case was so great that only she could have done so. Indeed, there was a sense of destiny about all of this that Raven, for one, could not quite fathom. "I can follow her out to sea, but no farther," Eagle remarked. "She will disappear into the depths and only come to the surface to breathe from time to time." This was, of course, how his people had followed her and made good on what the women had asked, that she give her life to them for the survival of this or that village, Raven recalled. It seemed all so long ago now. Yet it was within her power to still confer upon the dead an opportunity at life anew. To do this, while at the same time doing the same for those who still lived, was an extremely clever feat, and one that Raven himself could not but be impressed by. Watching his dear friend depart and then vanish into the distance, Raven realized that Whale was herself already long gone. It would have to be a journey of some weeks at least, far beyond the capacity of any, except perhaps Salmon. But the idea that each time Whale stranded herself had a deeper reason, a more profound rationale, still resonated in his head. Something about this new knowledge, coupled with that regarding the relationship these strange persons, themselves stranded and yet not by choice, had with his own original children, was percolating in his consciousness. He would find a giant tree and meditate on it, he proposed to himself. Eagle would be back in a day or two at most. It would be fitting to rest on the very island that had been the place of unrest for so long, so Raven turned and flew back down and into the dense forest. All was still in shadow, which was disturbing at first, but as Raven began to slumber, his head laying against the broad trunk of an aging hemlock, he was able to listen to the voice of the trees around him. It was a quiet, dulcet murmur, the language of the fronds and ferns swaying in the gentle breeze, still cool but not as foreboding. It told him that in time the trees would be able to shed their shadows, because no longer did they gain sustenance from a soil shadowed by the remains of the strangers. So that was it. That was the explanation of why the island appeared as it did. Finally falling into a deeper slumber, Raven realized that in a different way he had once again begun the process of bringing light into this little part of the world, just as he had done in that brash and bold way with Sun himself. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you again when we read Chapter 2, Raven and the Dig Site.